Okay, welcome. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center located in Glen Cove, New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you to one of our weekly programs called the Curator's Corner, where I explore an object in detail that's in our gallery. This was a program that we started, a series that we started a couple of months ago when our building was closed due to Corona. We're still closed, although the planning for reopening is underway, but I'm going to continue doing these online programs in the meantime. As always, I want to encourage you during the presentation, if you have questions, to use the Q&A button on Zoom, either at the bottom or the top of the screen, and type in your question. I will certainly make time for it at the end and may be able to respond as I'm going along. There's one other bit of housekeeping I wanted to take care of before I start, and that's to make an appeal. As I'm sure you know, these are difficult times for nonprofits, and that is the case with the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. As a way to support our online programs, we're asking for 200 people to make contributions of $100. That would raise $20,000 for our online programs and make a big difference in enabling us to continue to operate like this. So I know $100 is not a small amount of money, but if we can get 200 of our viewers to make that donation, it'll be a big help. So maybe the cost of coffee at Starbucks for a month or dinner for two at a nice restaurant, instead of those things, if you could send a donation to us, I would be very grateful. Just go to our website at www.hmtcli.org and click the Give Now button. Okay. I'll leave my request out there for now, but really would be grateful for our programming. I'm going to talk today about a flag, a large Israeli flag that we have in our gallery that was created in one of the DP camps after World War II and given to Holocaust survivor Mordechai Carmeli as a keepsake when he left the DP camp and moved to Israel. The flag was donated to our museum by Mordechai Carmeli and his daughter, Sigalit Shmuley. And although Mordechai passed away a few years ago, after the flag was added to our collection, you can see him in a lovely photo that was taken when the flag was installed in our gallery. We're very grateful for the donation, and I'm particularly thankful for all the help that Sigalit Shmuley has offered me over the past few weeks. The flag itself is a fascinating object and connected to a range of events that came at the wake of the war, but it's also inextricably tied to the story of Mordechai Carmeli and his amazing journey that led from Romania to Israel. Let me start by looking closely at the flag. First, I'm not sure you can tell from this slide, but this is a large flag, maybe 2.5 feet in height and 4 feet or so in width. On first glance, it appears like the Israeli flag, but as you can see in this comparison, obviously there's some differences. The official Israeli flag on the left and our flag on the right. One obvious difference is that our flag has a golden star of David in the middle rather than a blue one. Another notable difference are the Hebrew words that are sewn into our flag. Above the Star of David, there are the words Naor, Chalutzi, Meuchad, and then there's a hyphen and the word Nocham. The first three words are translated as United Pioneering Youth. The fourth word is not actually a word, it's an acronym like NATO or NAFTA, using the first sounds or the first syllables from the other words. So in this case, Nocham uses the no, the cha from chalo, and the mem from the last word. And you get Nocham. It doesn't translate to anything. It's a shortened name for the United Pioneering Youth. There's also one other word on our flag down on the bottom, a bit lower, which says Germania, or in Germany. So overall, it says the name of the Zionist youth organization, United Pioneering Youth, also known as Nocham, and then in Germany. Nocham was one of several Zionist youth groups to emerge in post-war Europe. It was founded in particular by several survivors from the Dachau concentration camp who saw the Jewish children in the DP camps as a group who needed particular services and direction, but also would be the possible future leaders of an Israeli or a Jewish state. I won't go into the full history of Zionism, but you may know that modern Zionism emerged in the late 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe as a reaction to anti-Semitism, but also in response to larger technological and social changes. The main goal of the Zionist movement, which was led by Theodor Herzl, was the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, then under Ottoman rule, and after World War I, under British rule. Even before any state was established, there was a flow of Jewish settlers going to Israel or to Palestine that grew in the 1920s and then even more so in the 1930s after the Nazis came to power in Germany. In the wake of the Holocaust, the Zionist mission and the calls for the creation of a Jewish homeland grew stronger, but so did opposition from Arabs in Palestine. In early 1947, the British referred the question of Palestine to the newly created United Nations, essentially throwing up their hands and leaving the tense situation in the hands of the UN. In November of 1947, the UN adopted a resolution calling to partition Palestine into separate independent Arab and Israeli or Arab and Jewish states. But before the resolution could be enacted, a civil war erupted in Palestine between Arab and Jewish forces. And 2 weeks later, the British announced they would withdraw their forces on May 15th of the following year, in 1948. The day before the British finally ended their rule in Palestine, on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. And on the following day, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War began, which would last into 1949. It was in this period, between the end of World War II in 1945 and the establishment of the State of Israel in May of 1948, that Zionist activities in DP camps surged. Groups like Nocham taught not only Hebrew language classes, but focused on developing farming and agricultural skills among the Jewish survivors and teaching them about the geography and topography of Palestine. At the same time, they worked to foster a nascent Israeli nationalism, teaching about the history of Zionism, promoting a love for the land, and preparing people to move to Palestine. Excuse me. Our flag offers a window into that time period, when there was an effort to create a new nation, to spark a love for it before it even existed, and then to populate it. The flag was made in a DP camp, I said, outside of Munich, sometime probably in late 1946 or early 1947. And as I mentioned, it was given as a gift to Mordechai Carmeli as he left the DP camp and headed to Israel. Mordechai's story, like the stories of most survivors, is unbelievable. And when I say unbelievable, what I really mean to say is, for me, living in suburban America, I can't imagine or comprehend the things he went through. He was born Marcu Weingarten in 1929 in Iași, Romania, the regional capital of Moldavia and a major center of Jewish life. Marcu was the Romanian version of Mordechai. Iași's Jewish roots go back to the late 15th century, when Jews fleeing from Spain had settled in that part of what became Romania. By the end of the 19th century, approximately half of the city's population were Jews. The Jewish population then went through a decline in the early 20th century as Jews moved north and west, but in 1930, Jews still made up about a third of the city's 105,000 population. When the Nazis invaded Poland, Romania initially chose to remain neutral, but in November of 1940, it joined the Axis alliance with Germany. Shortly after that, Mordechai's father, Hirsch, was taken to slave labor camp, leaving Mordechai, at the time only 10 years old, with his two sisters, his mother, Pesha, and his grandmother. Here's a photograph of young Mordechai, perhaps a year or so before his father was taken to a slave labor camp. An adorable guy. And here's a photograph of his parents, Hirsch and Pesha, captured, I think, with a certain view of concern or sadness in their eyes. To survive, the family sent Mordechai out of the house without the yellow star on to try and find food or to raise some money. He managed to befriend a Nazi officer who he helped carry groceries for and did odd jobs for, and was rewarded with food which he brought home and which was used to help not only his family but his neighbors survive. Miraculously, Mordechai and his family survived the Yashi pogrom at the end of June of 1941, when Romanian and German soldiers, along with local residents, murdered over 13,000 Jews, approximately a third of the city's Jewish population. For another 2 years, Mordechai and his family managed to survive in the city that had witnessed this outpouring of anti-Semitism and hate. But then the tide of war changed. The Red Army of the Soviet Union advanced towards Romania. I have a series of maps that spans 1943 and 1944 that shows the Red Army's progression back into the land that they had previously lost. And you can see Yashi was retaken by the Soviets in July of 1944, but remained in an area of fighting for several months. As the Russian advance proceeded through the region, Mordechai's father, Hirsch, returned, having survived 3 years of slave labor. But Yashi continued to suffer under air bombardment, and life there remained tenuous. It was in that atmosphere, with his father back to help his mother and 2 sisters, that Mordechai, of now 15 years old, along with a group of 11 other teenagers, decided to go to Hungary, where they were told there was a rabbi arranging transportation to Israel. Ironically, Mordechai's Zionist views were fueled after anti-Semitic laws forced him to leave public school and forced him instead to join a secret Hebrew school that had Zionist leanings. While Mordechai planned his departure, his parents and sister decided that it would be safer to stay at their home. Decided to stay in their home, hoping that Russians would allow life to go back to the way it had been before 1939. Their optimism was partially based on the fact that 2 of Mordechai's aunts were active in the communist underground and believed that their connections would lead to rewards later on. But Mordechai's parents did not stop him from trying to get to Israel. As things turned out, Mordechai and his group made it to Hungary, but found no rabbi and no transportation to Israel. Instead, they made contact with the Haganah Underground, the Zionist paramilitary group, which was helping to get Jews to Israel. And the Haganah helped the group of Mordechai and his friends to get across into Vienna and advised them to get to Munich, and particularly to a DP camp in the town of Bayerisch Gemein, where there was supposedly a children's DP camp. Amazingly, Mordechai and the group managed to get to Munich and found the DP camp, which housed about 120 children aged from 3 to 16. The camp was funded by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the UNRRA, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as the Joint, and other American aid. But it was largely run by Nocham, the Zionist United Youth Pioneers. Nocham taught the children various skills that could be useful in finding work, including sewing for girls, woodworking for boys, and farming. This is a photograph of a similar type of sewing class in the Landsberg DP camp. And you can see the Zionist messages with Hebrew writing and photographs of Theodor Herzl and other Zionist leaders on the walls. Mordechai, who was one of the older children at the camp near Munich, was named as a counselor and given responsibility of helping to take care of a group of about 20 younger girls. Here's a photograph of Mordechai in the DP camp and a photograph of 2 of the girls that he took care of. Mordechai stayed in the DP camp for a year, becoming like a father figure to some of the younger children and developing strong bonds with them. But the goal was always to get to Israel, and sometime late in 1946 or early 47, the Haganah came to prepare the older children, including Mordechai, for departure to Israel. giving them arms training and going over the logistics of how to get to Israel. As the time approached when Mordechai would leave, the girls from his group, who also expected to eventually make it to Israel, presented Mordechai with the flag as a way to remember them and to show him the skills that they had learned, to demonstrate their pride in their abilities. And here let me say a few words about the design of the Israeli flag. I mentioned before that modern Zionism, with its call for the formation of a Jewish state, emerged in the late 19th century. And by the 1890s, that movement had created a Zionist flag to be used to promote the Zionist mission. Some 50 years before there was a state of Israel, there was a flag for the future state, although it was changed somewhat during the intervening 50 years. The roots of the Israeli national flag go back to 1896, when Theodor Herzl proposed a flag for the Zionist movement, suggesting, as he wrote, a white flag with 7 golden stars. The white field symbolizes our pure new life. The stars are the 7 golden hours of our working day. A sketch he included in his diary showed the 6 stars forming the points of a Star of David. When the first Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, the Star of David, with its 6 stars on the vertices, was merged with the Lion of Judah to form the symbol for that first Zionist Congress. And for those of you who saw my earlier program about a light bulb that we have on display in our museum that was from a synagogue in Drama, Greece, you'll remember that that same symbol from the Zionist Congress was on that light bulb, suggesting that the synagogue had a Zionist tilt. That symbol was also used and turned into a flag. David Wolfson, who would be elected as the vice president at the first Zionist Congress and would later be the second president of the organization, took the symbol that had been created for the meeting and merged it with the traditional blue and white colors of a talit, the Jewish prayer shawl, to create the flag that hung over the meeting room in Basel that you see here. In this black and white image, you cannot really see the colors of the flag, but most later depictions show it with blue stripes and a central shield of gold. At the Second Zionist Congress, a year later, the flag was simplified, using just 2 colors, blue and white, and relying on a more traditional Star of David at the center. This flag, which later became the national flag of Israel, was adopted in 1898 as the official Zionist flag. In a somewhat amazing, surprising photograph from 1904 at the World's Fair in St. Louis, you can see here the flag is flying alongside other national flags atop the fair's Hall of Nations. And it was this flag, the Zionist flag, that the Nazis referenced in 1936 after they had passed an earlier law banning Jews from displaying the Reichsflag, the swastika. And they said the Zionist blue-white flag, together with the symbols of all different Zionist groups, is valid in the Reich as the Jewish flag. So the flag made by the girls in Mordechai's DP camp was not actually intended as an Israeli flag, as the country hadn't been founded, nor had the flag been adopted. Instead, they produced a version of the Zionist flag that had been in use for almost 50 years by that time. Indeed, at the same time as the girls were making our flag that hangs in our gallery, the World Zionist Organization produced a poster celebrating their 50th anniversary. And they chose an image of Theodor Herzl in front of 2 versions of the Zionist flag, the one used at the first meeting of the Zionist Congress and the flag that had been chosen the following year. Again, this was in 1947, so a year before the State of Israel was founded and well before Israel had chosen its national flag. Their poster, like our flag, celebrated the Zionist flag. It's only in hindsight, because we know that it became the Israeli flag, that we look at our flag in our gallery and see it as an Israeli flag. Those in Mordechai's DP camp didn't know that Israel would be named an independent state in May of 1948, nor did they know that Israel would choose this as its flag. They made the Zionist flag. I should add that it was not foreordained that the Zionist flag would become the Israeli national flag. In May of 1948, soon after the establishment of the State of Israel, the Provisional State Council invited the public to submit proposals for a new national flag. 164 people responded to the competition, submitting some 450 different designs. And at least initially, some leading politicians, notably the Minister of Foreign Affairs, felt the new Israeli flag should be different from the Zionist flag. His concern was that if the Israeli flag looked the same as the Zionist flag, then when Jews around the world flew the Zionist flag, it would appear that they were flying the flag of a foreign country and could be charged with dual loyalty or not being supportive of their own country. However, when Zionist representatives from around the globe said they needn't be concerned about that, the Zionist flag was adopted as the flag for the State of Israel, although I think the color of blue was changed in a very slight way. I know I've bounced around a bit, but before I finish, I want to go back to Mordechai's story and explain how the flag got from the DP camp outside of Munich to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove. As I said earlier, sometime in late 46 or early 47, Mordechai, now with a flag in his possession, as a reminder from his group of girls, left the DP camp and headed to Marseille, where he was to board a boat for Palestine. Mordechai traveled with a small group of other boys, but they had to walk to Marseille, some 700 miles away. Amazingly, the group made it to Marseille, and after some waiting, were packed onto a fishing boat, which made the voyage to Tel Aviv in about a week. Mordechai arrived in the wake of the formal establishment of the State of Israel and in the early stages of the First Arab-Israeli War. As a 15 or 16-year-old, he was too young to serve in the army right away, but instead was taken to a kibbutz in the north of Israel. And when he was old enough, he completed his military service and then returned to the kibbutz. Mordechai proceeded to make a life in Israel, eventually opening a shoe store in Haifa and meeting and marrying Nira, a woman who had been born and raised in Israel, although her parents had emigrated from Poland in the 1920s. Mordechai and Nira had 2 children, a daughter Sigalit and a son Ofer. According to his daughter, Mordechai never said much about how he survived the war or what it was like to walk from Romania to Munich, or about his time in the DP camp. She said the culture in Israel did not encourage survivors to talk about what they had seen or experienced in the Holocaust. This was partly due to a feeling held by some native Israelis that European Jews had somehow allowed the Holocaust to happen. But Mordechai also had his own internal guilt for having survived when so many others were killed. And the result of those 2 things meant he stayed silent. It was that same culture that may have encouraged Mordechai to change his name. Weingarten did not sound Israeli. He chose Carmeli because of the famed winery and vineyards of Carmel in Israel. It was a name he thought that made sense as an Israeli version of Weingarten. And there was a personal link, as Carmel was a winery that was started by the Rothschilds, and he, Mordechai, had stayed actually in 2 Rothschild buildings in his long journey across Europe. In short, it seemed like a name that fit him. His daughter told me a lovely story about Mordechai's name change and Mordechai's later doubts about whether it had been a wise move. Apparently, Mordechai had 2 very close calls with death, one in Yashi when he was selling nuts to Russian soldiers, and one at the kibbutz in northern Israel. And both times, in hindsight, he and his friends could not believe that he survived. The only explanation he could come up with was that somehow God had protected him during those 2 close calls. Later, after he changed his name, he had one more very close call, suffering a heart attack and being officially dead for some 4 minutes before he was revived. After that 3rd close call, he wondered if changing his name had made it difficult for God to find him and caused the 4-minute delay. In the end, when he passed away in 2013, his family made sure to put both of his names, Weingarten and Carmeli, on his gravestone. It was a few years before he died that Mordechai's daughter, Sigalit, saw the flag in her father's home and asked him about it. He started talking, opening up about things that she had not heard before. He had lost touch with the girls who he had been so close to in the DP camp, but he always treasured the flag and kept it in his possession. And as he talked about it, it became an important bridge between Mordechai and his daughter, linking her to his early life. By the time they had that discussion, his daughter had moved to New York, coming here in 1984 when her husband was attending medical school and moving out to Long Island in the late 1990s. About 10 years ago, she learned about our museum and reached out about donating her flag to us. It seemed, she said, better to have the flag preserved and on display than tucked away in her father's drawer. We were honored to accept it and believe it provides a wonderful way to talk about Zionism, the creation of the State of Israel, and the journeys that Jews were forced to take in Europe in order to survive. I'm going to stop there. If you have questions, please post them in the chat window, I think, or in the Q&A window, and I will answer them. Let me take a moment before I get to that to just mention a couple of other programs that we have coming up. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Helen Turner and I, the Director of Education, and I will be giving a joint virtual tour of our museum with a new effort to engage the viewers in some discussions about what we show. On Monday at 1 o'clock, Professor John Barrett of St. John's University will be presenting a talk to mark the anniversary of Justice Robert Jackson's closing statement at the first Nuremberg trial, focusing on the importance of those trials and Robert Jackson's argument. And next Wednesday at 11 o'clock, please join me again for another edition of my Curator's Corner. I'm going to be talking about a small bell that we have in our collection, which was made to commemorate the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. You can find a full list of our programs on our website under the Events tab. And once again, I ask you to become one of 200 people to donate $100 to support our virtual programming. Help us raise $20,000 that we need. Okay, let me turn to look at your questions. Who made the design of the first Israeli flag and when? Yeah, so it evolved over time. It started with Theodor Herzl's design and then was changed in 1899 for the Second Zionist Congress by David Wolfson. And that eventually was chosen, or that was chosen as the Zionist flag, and that was adopted by the State of Israel in 1948. What happened to Mordechai's parents and sisters? Oh, I should have mentioned that. They eventually managed to make it to Israel too. And so there was the family reunified in Israel. What allowed Mordechai to leave the DP camp when so many others weren't able to leave? The DP camp that he was in was, as I said, closely tied to this Zionist youth organization and to the Haganah, and they were all working together to get Jews to, or to get survivors to Israel. So there was it took some time, obviously, but that was the plan from the very beginning, and one of the solutions that was chosen to dealing with the fact that there were so many people left in these DP camps. Did Mr. Carmeli have any contact with his family after he left? Yeah, I said they managed to get there. I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier. I haven't heard of the Zionist youth movement, somebody writes. Did it exist before or after the DP camps? Nocham was something that was started after the war by some survivors of the Holocaust and established really in its mission was to work with the DP camps or the Jews that were in DP camps to get them to go to Israel and to train them for that or to prepare them for that trip. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you at some of our other programs soon. Have a good day.